done this 100 times and I'm not nervous.
That's right.
Actually, my children are in the audience, so actually I'm a little bit nervous.
Yeah, I was about to say, with Sharon in the audience too, you sort of go, I can't just get away with it.
I'm afraid this is the moment where my boy realizes that I'm not nearly as cool as he thought I was. I'm not a garbage man. All right.
We're good? Okay, right. Welcome back, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speakers for today. They'll be tag teaming it, I'm told. So Kevin Orman-Rossiter is Councillor of the Royal Society of Victoria. He is a physicist and a child of the space age. And we also have Morgan Saletta, who is Anthropologist of Science and Technology here at the University of Melbourne. And they will be talking to us about how all of humanity can benefit from space mining. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So what we're going to be talking about is space mining, but more precisely how we can benefit from it. And you don't actually have to be a nerd like myself who's caught up in the space race to actually know that asteroid mining is one of those really big stories. Why is it a really big story? Well, let's face it, it sounds like that marvellous crossover between science fiction and science fact. And probably ever since Galileo discovered the moons of Jupiter, or realised that there was actually mountains on the moon, and everyone's gone, ooh, I wonder if we could travel there, what would we find, or could we dig up, or what would be there? And let's face it, the last big exploration was when the Portuguese and Spanish found the New World. So asteroids are seen as part of that final frontier, and they've been written about since, I don't know, wherever. As soon as people discovered that there was worlds outside of this Earth, we started talking about them. As simple as science fiction books from the 18th and 19th century to some of the pioneers of space travel itself, including Konstantin Tozalovsky, the Russian pioneer. Part of his driver was actually, how do we explore space? So he invented rockets when they first came around. But it's more on that now, isn't it? Because we've got lots and lots of advocates of space mining. People such as Pete Diamandis, who's the X-Prize founder and president of Planetary Resources. So we actually have companies now who are actually focused on asteroid mining. Companies, so people are actually putting in lots and lots of money, hoping that they're going to make trillions or billions, or a lot of money anyway. So this is big business now. And a lot of the selling point is about utopian dreams, about selling it to people going, no longer will the 9 billion or so people on Earth have to be scraping in existence. We're actually going to be, using these. I think it's nice following on from Sophia's talks, because we're actually talking about the social side of science and technology. It's a really important bit. Some of the people like John Lewis, the professor of planetary science at University of Arizona, and he's the chief scientist at Deep Space Industries, another company that's involved in or hoping to do asteroid mining. He said, quote, "The limited resources and finite living space are tired old myths." So there's big things invested in the dreams, and they go all the way to the scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who sort of says, this is going to be the next big boom. But a lot of that relies on what I would call, or Morgan and I would call, and lots of other people would call, a fairly tired economic myth, and that is, if someone makes a few $1 trillion, then eventually the rest of us are going to get some sort of trickle-down benefit from it. It's never happened in the past, and so we can't really expect it to happen in the future. So even though we're both really big enthusiasts for asteroid mining, for space exploration, as I said, I grew up as a kid, I watched the first landing on the moon. I wanted to be an astronaut. I ended up doing physics. It was close, but not quite. But we're really big enthusiasts about this, but the really big enthusiastic bit is to actually go, how can the whole of humanity benefit from this, not just a few trillionaires? We're not the only ones sceptical. Let's face it, you've had, there's enough science fiction books that show, how it could go wrong, or, classic names like asteroid wars. That's the last one we want to actually see, or some of the things that you think of horrors that happened in terms of explorations all around the place. So if we actually just look at that, it says Earth is spiralling into environmental disaster. That sounds rather familiar as a start. With floods and earthquakes destroying the lives of millions, not only the energy and natural resources of space can save Earth's economy in the struggle over the incalculable wealth of the asteroids, many will die and many will achieve more than they ever dreamed possible. Sounds ominously familiar, and let's not forget, this is actually no longer science fiction. There's some very serious people writing in journals, in publications, in economic papers discussing how this can be a reality, and you can do a Google search and you'll be actually quite surprised about the number of serious articles that are now coming up on asteroid mining. So it's not science fiction anymore, as Jean-Jacques Dordain, former director of ESA, put it. It's the real world. We're here now. And it is actually quite astounding. I was about to say quite astronomical. That's almost a stupid statement. But there is a potentially $1 trillion industry. For example, this one small asteroid which went by in 2011, it's 600 metres by 300 metres, but its estimated value in current terms is $5 trillion. That's a lot of money in anyone's language. Lots of the near-Earth objects, so near-Earth asteroids such as Davida, which are valued at $100 trillion. Ludicrous amounts of money. Money that is even big by US standards. I love this one because this is from Planetary Resources themselves, and this sort of shows how they see it. Anything you can get on a one-page infographic has got to be true, as I always think. But it basically says, we've got metal-rich, and those of you who are here this morning for Tanya's talk about Jupiter will have remembered her talking about metal-rich things and water-rich parts of the solar system. So basically you could go, if we have a metal-rich asteroid, we can mine it, and that's going to be immensely wealthy for whoever does. Water-rich asteroids, they're our path to further space exploration. So that's going to provide fuel for voyages to Mars, voyages to Jupiter, exploration in the true sense of the word. And we're actually getting quite close. This year will be a NASA voyage to one of the close near-Earth objects. They're not exactly going to make billions from it. As a matter of fact, it's going to cost them $800 million. But still, the important point is that they're actually doing the first bit of exploration. They're going to land, they're going to look, land, and bring back a sample of an asteroid. Once you've done it once, one of the things that we all know from that is it doesn't take much to do it a few more times, and anybody who's watching progress of companies like SpaceX know that they're really, really focused on getting this stuff right. So once NASA's done it, there'll be many other people who will be quite keen to follow. And that brings us to this point, because the first space age, the one I grew up in, was hell-bent for leather, based around one statement by one president. But we've actually got time to pause, take breath and go, what happens now? We're on the verge of it. We could probably do it. If someone said, I'm going to be on an asteroid and mining it within 5 years, that's not improbable. It's possibly highly probable. So now is the time to actually think about, what do we do with that wealth? What do we actually want to happen, rather than go, that just happened. Bugger. So the $1 trillion question is, who owns the sky? And I'm going to hand over to Morgan, who's going to follow on and answer that question.
Okay, so the $1 trillion question, who owns the sky? This isn't a new question, and it's been answered at least partially by the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which serves as a bedrock of international space law. It was largely hammered out between the United States and the then Soviet Union, and some 104 countries are a party to it. What does the Outer Space Treaty say? It says, outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. The exploration and the use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, and shall be the province of all mankind. So the trillion-dollar answer to the trillion-dollar question, who owns the sky, is that we all do. You, me, everyone. The sky literally belongs to all of us. It's a global commons, like the deep sea floor, and we should all benefit from it. And that's not some pie-in-the-sky utopian dream answer. That's actually international law. But because the Outer Space Treaty is generally interpreted as denying private ownership as well as national sovereignty, it's sometimes claimed to be an obstacle to commercial venture, and in particular to resource exploration. Recently, companies such as Planetary Resources have become vocal lobbyists for establishing private property in space, arguing for serious modification or even an end to the Outer Space Treaty, and claiming, we'll say against the evidence, that without fee simple ownership, there is no incentive for commercial exploration. The much discussed Space Act of 2015 made a move in this direction, and some have argued that it goes against the Outer Space Treaty, but the act was deliberately vague about international obligations and has left plenty of wiggle room. But the problem and the dangers are clear to see. China, India, and other nations that are becoming spacefaring nations won't be far behind in deciding to make their own rules. And people like Joanne Gabrinowitz, who's a space lawyer and editor of the Journal of Space Law, who testified for the Congressional Committee, worries that if the United States is seen as playing fast and loose with the Outer Space Treaty, countries like China may very well decide to make their own rules. And the dangers of that are that you get the equivalent of an international Wild West land grab. So we're arguing, in essence, that the Outer Space Treaty is as relevant now as it ever was. There were excellent reasons to explicitly rule out sovereign claims, and the excellent reasons were that by ruling out sovereign claims, we could hope that we would not have conflicts over territory in space. That doesn't change when you have corporations, or, for example, corporations acting as proxies for nation states. And, in fact, it turns out that ownership, if what you mean by ownership is the way you and I may own land around a house, isn't necessary for private enterprise to engage in profitable resource extraction. Companies like BHP Billiton or Shell Oil routinely extract publicly owned resources here in Australia. I think all of the mineral resources in Australia de facto belong to the Crown. I think that's true. And they pay leases in America to public land as well. They pay leases and royalties on production. And there are numerous terrestrial examples where resources are profitably exploited in the absence of fee simple ownership. So companies don't need ownership in outer space. What they need is legal clarity, and that's true. They need legal clarity, they need a licensing scheme, and they need to know what the royalty rates are going to be. So we need a peaceful, stable framework in which nations, public and private ventures, and commercial operations can thrive and profit, not fight over asteroid resources and riches. And we need to ensure that the benefits to humanity aren't just pie in the sky. Building on the Outer Space Treaty, can we come up with a balanced, pragmatic approach that will promote commercial and profit-driven activities while also producing tangible benefits to all of humanity? Generally, when we try to answer these kinds of questions, space policy experts and others like ourselves will look at terrestrial examples and models when trying to come up with workable models. The Geneva-based International Telecommunications Union, which coordinates commercial satellite orbits, is frequently cited as a potential model, as is the Deep Sea Floor Authority established by the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas to regulate deep sea mining. We believe that the establishment of an international body is necessary to ensure that conflicts don't arise over asteroid mining, but we believe it's not sufficient to ensure that humanity benefits from the exploitation of resources that belong to all of us. There is, however, a terrestrial model which does offer the potential to pragmatically ensure that humanity shares in the upcoming resources boom, or the potential resource boom. And that model comes from Alaska, which is frequently termed the last frontier, so fittingly enough, a lesson from the last frontier for the final frontier. So the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is now over 40 years old. It's a resource wealth fund which derives its revenue primarily from leases on oil fields and royalties on production. In and of itself, of course, that's hardly unique, nor is the Alaska Permanent Fund particularly large as far as sovereign wealth funds go. But it has a very unique feature. It pays every single permanent resident of Alaska, regardless of age, a yearly dividend. And this is a very unique feature. The Alaska Permanent Fund and the dividend was the brainchild of Libertarian Republican governor of Alaska, Jay Hammond, and it enjoys widespread support across the political spectrum in Alaska. According to Hammond, he was the governor of Alaska from 1974 to 82. The idea began when he was a mayor of a very poor fishing village on the shore of Bristol Bay in the 1960s. Bristol Bay is one of the world's wealthiest fisheries, richest fisheries. And he couldn't help but notice that while the fishing companies were extracting billions, literally billions of dollars annually worth of fish, the villages themselves were dirt poor. So as a mayor, he proposed a 3% tax on the fish production with the idea that this would be put into an investment fund and paid dividends to the villagers. He called his plan the Bristol Bay Incorporated. Unfortunately, I guess, the plan was rejected, but in 1967, he had a chance to put this idea to work as the governor in Alaska. And he suggested that rather than permitting government politicians to decide what to do with the money, that a portion of the money that was invested in a profit-making trust would be paid as a yearly dividend to Alaskans. The first dividend payment was made in 1982. In 2015, that payment amounted to $2,000, more or less, to every single permanent resident in Alaska, again, regardless of age. So for a family, that can actually be sizable, particularly since there are many people in Alaska that are relatively poor, particularly indigenous people. Before I gave this speech, I could honestly say I never thought I would have a single good thing to say about this lady, Sarah Palin. But what's important about the Alaska Permanent Fund, what's important to realize is that this is a model that doesn't come from a social democracy or some left-wing ideology. Hammond was a conservative, and the Alaska Permanent Fund enjoys widespread support across the political spectrum, as I said. In fact, in 2008, the same year that Sarah Palin became John McCain's running mate when she was governor of Alaska, she slapped a one-time excess profits tax on oil companies who were making record profits at a time of high gasoline prices, which gave a one-time boost to the dividend, which meant that every single person in Alaska received a dividend of $3,200. So for someone like Palin's family, husband Todd, sons Track and Trig, and daughters Bristol, Willow, and Piper, that came about to some $22,000. And crucially, this isn't wealth redistribution. Alaskans rightly see themselves as owners of the public resources in Alaska and see this dividend as a rightful share of the profits that are being made. Sarah Palin, in her typical down-home fashion, says this is a big darn deal for Alaska. That non-renewable resource, of course, is so valuable. The oil companies don't own the resources. They have leases and the right to develop our resources for us. And we share value. We're partners there because they do the producing for us. But we own the resources. Again, I never thought I'd have something good to say about her. But she's right. So it turns out the idea of a citizen's dividend or a trust fund for everybody is not exactly a new idea, either in American or international politics. Thomas Paine, better known to the British as a rabble-rouser, to Americans as a revolutionary hero, also known for works such as The Age of Reason. His pamphlet, Common Sense, helped rouse the American colonies to rebellion in 1776. But he also published this work, Agrarian Justice, the full title of which is Agrarian Justice, Opposed to Agrarian Law and to Agrarian Monopoly, being a plan for ameliorating the condition of man by creating in every nation a national fund. In essence, he proposed what we would now think of as a property tax, which would go into a universal fund and become payable to every citizen at the age of 21. So what does all this mean for space mining? Well, firstly, we need to establish an international space authority. And that's an idea which has broad support among space policy experts. The details will have to be hammered out. This authority would, in turn, in our view, levy a production royalty on mining companies, the same business-as-usual model that applies to petroleum and mining companies here on Earth. An example of such a production royalty would be the 12.5% that the United States levies on production on federal lands, which earned the government some $13.5 billion last year in the US, just on federal lands. That's not on state lands. This money would then be invested in a fund, managed perhaps under the aegis of the World Bank, for example. And importantly, by bypassing national governments and potentially corrupt politicians, corrupt governments, this would avoid some of the pitfalls and the opposition to redistribution, which are commonplace when things like the Deep Sea Authority and the largely failed Moon Treaty have been discussed. And while even very small returns, dividends to you and I, citizens of the first world, might be largely symbolic, even very small amounts of money could make a real difference to people in the third world. And if we're truly honest about wanting to do something about ameliorating extreme poverty in the world, which the nations of the world have signed on to as part of the United Nations Millennium Goals, we want to end extreme poverty in the world, or we say we do, this might be one way to go. Perhaps not just with asteroids, maybe with deep sea mining as well. So of course, technologically speaking, there may be some real issues, right? Creating a payment system for every eligible person on Earth. But if you think about it, those are minor issues compared to the technological challenges of asteroid mining. Mobile banking, for example, is rapidly expanding in countries in Africa where access to traditional banking is extremely limited. According to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation report, mobile penetration in Africa jumped 3% in 2002 to 48% in 2010 and is expected to hit 72% next year. Here we have a photo. This is a banking system in Kenya where people can send money by phone to each other. So, in conclusion, Kevin and I are both space enthusiasts. We really do want to see a space economy emerge, and resource exploitation in situ is going to be a fundamental part of that. Whether or not there ever is a trillion-dollar industry, regardless, there will be resource exploitation, and there will be a value put to it. And we agree with the proponents of space mining who argue that the benefits to humanity could potentially be very large. But we think that in order for that to happen, we need a system in place. We can't just have empty rhetoric where we say we want humanity to benefit, but the people that really benefit are the 1% of the 1%. People that are already billionaires want to become trillionaires, and whose companies are based in places like Luxembourg or the United States. And we need to remember that mining companies don't own the resources, we do. And like Alaskans, we should ensure that we receive our proper share. The sky really does belong to all of us. And because there's been a strong science fiction theme running throughout this talk, we'll end on this note from the well-beloved but ended too soon television show Firefly. So I suppose before we take some questions, first thank you, but I'd also just like to add an addendum there that clearly perhaps asteroid mining is pie in the sky. But the idea that all of humanity should benefit from global commons like the deep sea floor, perhaps even fisheries, even nationally here in Australia from the mineral wealth in the country, the idea of citizens' dividends on resources that are commonly owned is an idea that we can apply here terrestrially perhaps long before we ever get to the asteroids in outer space. So, thank you.
Take questions?
You have a roving mic? If not, we can rove.
Yeah, we can just relay the question.
Have you seen, or have you got available, an essay of what is actually in the asteroid material per kilogram, say?
We haven't got that in the presentation, but if people are actually interested, there's actually a fascinating amount of, if I call it geological, planetological data on asteroids, both from spectroscopy perspective and also that planetologists have actually looked and said, this group of asteroids are created from this part of the solar system's history, therefore we would expect them to be rich in these minerals, these metals. So there's actually a lot of data on that, believe it or not. And those estimates that, although we've glibly shown them in one slide saying, this is worth $1 trillion, they're real estimates from geologists or planetologists who have looked at what those asteroids are and said, we're pretty sure this is. One of the reasons for NASA doing their exploration later on is actually to test and prove those theories. So no, we haven't actually got an asteroid sitting here that you can actually pull apart and measure it, but people have done the remote equivalent of that.
Yeah, and looked at meteorite composition,
Yeah.
et cetera. But
So-
certainly with the OSIRIS-REx 2 kilogram sample, we'll get a confirmation of some of that.
Yes?
I have a question about the global citizen dividends. So if everyone is receiving the global citizen dividend, how do you prevent the resource collectors from just shifting the cost of that to consumers, which would be felt more strongly by wealthy, high-end consumers, effectively resulting in a redistribution of wealth?
Well, that happens right now every time you drive your car, right? So the global oil companies, right, who pay royalties on production in whatever country they're producing oil on, I mean, it is reflected. In fact, it largely comes out of their profits. If you look at how the royalty rates that are relatively low affect, and there's a lot of literature on this. I'm not an economist, but there's a lot of literature on how it affects price structure. It largely actually affects the profits and not oil prices. I would expect that with mineral resources, the system would be quite similar. But I mean, in short, I would say, hey, wealthy consumers can deal with it. I mean, in the end, if that were the real issue, I don't think that's going to be an issue.
Yeah, up the back there.
You said that space mining can contribute a lot to the economy, global economy. Is there some ways the space mining industry can even contribute to, I don't know, like general space exploration? Like, can it drive space exploration?
The question, in case I'll relay the question, was about
This slide.
about how space mining could drive the space exploration. I think that would happen in probably two ways. One, like anything, you're creating an industry that then has lots of attendance parts to it. So, mining in itself tends to create a whole swag of industries around it. I can't see any difference in this case, except I actually expect to see more space exploration, because one of the outcomes that we would see, which even from this slide, which is that one of the things that actually holds back space exploration, unless you're in a science fiction book or film, is the fact that to get stuff off the Earth, you've got to you've got to use a hell of a lot of fuel to get mass up into the space area to start off with. So if you can mine water or minerals, then one of the great things we've just discovered is 3D printers. You can start printing stuff there. So you could actually print bases based on minerals you pull out of an asteroid and put them into something more useful, such as places for exploration. You can use the water you find on asteroids or near-Earth objects to fuel further exploration. So yes, I think that even if you're looking at asteroid mining as a really dirty, it's a terrible economic thing, there's no science, there's no technology in it, it would create that. Definitely just by looking at history of exploration for, economic purposes. That was the whole point of the Portuguese and the Spanish sailing off and trying to find new ways to the Indies, and out of that we got South and North America. That was purely driven by economics, and look where it got us. Oh. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, so I think certainly, I agree with Kevin, although not everyone benefited equally from the conquest of North and South America.
I wasn't going to...
just make sure we understand. Just that small caveat in there. But in situ resource use from asteroids is a big driver of this, and probably will be a driver before the metals mining actually becomes something. Being able to, any sort of long-term space exploration is going to be a need to use in situ resources, and near-Earth asteroids in particular that are water-rich, you can use that water to make fuel. And that's fuel that you don't have to lift out of Earth's gravity well at an astronomical cost.
I think the question in the centre first, this there, yeah.
Would space mining produce any problems such as increasing space debris and
Would space mining create any environmental issues? I'll rephrase that. Hell yeah! If we do it the same way as we've done on mining, and I won't even mention BHP and various countries, they're busy doing stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of attendant issues you'd have to take into account. Space debris, yes, it's one of our big concerns already, and we've hardly even left the Earth. There's lots of concerns about junk that we've left around, or small amounts of debris, and the hazard they create. So yeah, you couldn't just imagine it going up there and landing on the asteroid, blowing it apart, and then going, got the bits I want, leave the rest for someone else to worry about. So yes, as part of this, of course, you would have to then come up with means of mining it. If I call it environmentally sensibly, then yeah, that would definitely be the case. I think your other part of your question was about global warming on Earth. I don't think so. The only problem, of course, is that if you have rockets blasting off from here every 30 seconds, then that's going to cause a small problem with our atmosphere. But again, that's part of the reason for looking at exploration and setting your space economy, if I can call it, outside of atmospheres and outside of environmentally sensitive areas.
If anyone's interested in those environmental issues, and I think space environmental issues are important.
Yeah.
Alice Gorman is going to be speaking on Saturday, and she's an expert in that area. And she'll be talking about space junk, but she speaks in particular often and writes often about the issues and the environmental issues that we will have to address if this is ever going to be done.
I'll go up the back first, and then I'll come back to you. Yeah.
You said there were increasing amounts of serious articles about asteroid mining. Do you know in particular
So the journal Space Policy has a lot of articles. Online, I think we showed a few. These range from semi-serious to more serious. So this was Asteroid Miner's Guide to the Galaxy. That's in Foreign Policy, which is a fairly serious magazine. New Republic, Slate, which is definitely popular media. But if you want scholarly articles, the place to go would be Acta Astronomica or the journal Space Policy.
I think in the set here.
Question about the treaties, if there's any parts of it to do with what happens if we find life on asteroids, and the ethical implications about contaminating an asteroid or something like that.
The Outer Space Treaty, I don't think so. It's pretty vague on that. NASA has in place some pretty strict biological protocols in terms of non-contamination. Things that the probes that we send out are maintained in clean rooms so that we don't contaminate places we visit with Earth life. But certainly, biologicals is going to be an issue. It's probably unlikely that we would find biologicals on asteroids or comets, but it's not 100% out of the question. Maybe more likely on some of the planets. But yeah, again, these kinds of issues are going to have to be dealt with, right? We don't want to go and just contaminate places like Mars, for example, where there might be life before we know whether there is or not. Certainly that's going to be a real issue. But in this case, there are, NASA and the ESA have really strict biological protocols.
I think there was one up the back again, yeah.
Just one question. You said again that this guy belongs to us all. And at the same time, you mentioned something about the US Space Act 2015. So, what do you see like in the future? Do you see that status quo will be maintained, or will the nations of the world adopt a more exploratory approach in the sense that the same thing as what happened during imperialism?
I think you'll find that, no, I won't say common sense will prevail. I think self-interest will prevail where at the moment we've got, or up until recently, there was basically only Russia and the US that had sophisticated exploration possibilities, but we've now got any number of countries, and even there's small, smaller countries and things like CubeSats, and there's even talk of, there's a big talk here of relaunching a space industry. So I think as people realise how easier it is now that you're not talking about human exploration necessarily, then there'll be a lot more people involved and a lot more people wanting to have a say in it. So I think it will start to get to the point where there will be forced to, and then self-interest will bring in it, because let's face it, the reason the Americans went there quickly was to stop the Russians getting there in the first place to the moon. There was great self-interest. I think you'll find that same self-interest will drive a necessity to talk about it in terms of the Chinese or even the Indians who are equally adept at launching, and as they've demonstrated, they can do it far cheaper than the US can ever do. So I think self-interest will probably work in its favour in terms of generating some sort of agreement. Otherwise, it will be the Wild West, as Morgan called it, which I'd hate to see.
I would agree with Kevin on that. I think the historical precedent says that we will. Remember, the Outer Space Treaty, which really is the bedrock of international space law, was hammered out between the United States and the Soviet Union, who were hardly friends.
At the time.
But they hammered it out for pragmatic reasons, and the language that's included in there may seem utopian, but it was meant for really pragmatic reasons. The International Telecommunications Union, again, it's pragmatic self-interest for everybody to cooperate in these areas. So if I want to send a satellite up, I need to know what kind of orbit it is. I'm assigned that orbit. I'm assigned that orbit through an international union. No one else is going to do it. And I think everybody's self-interest will prevail in this. So, yeah, enlightened self-interest, backing pragmatism. Mr. Carter.
I might just stand, it's probably better, so you don't have to relay. Hello. So, Kevin and Morgan, as you know, I'm going to rush out and found my exploration company after this talk.
You've got your flag ready to
Yeah, flag. Well, this is my question, in fact. So we're talking about, we've talked about this metaphysical concept that we own the sky. I'm not sure how many light years out that extends exactly. But let's say we adopt that as a principle. Where is the conversation at the moment about the criteria by which an entity can claim a preferential right to start mining a particular body? I think we're past the planting a flag on the rock stage, that doesn't carry any weight in international law. What do we need to plant on this object? Do we need to have some sort of robot lander land permanently on the rock? Is a flyby enough? Is an identification of resources enough? Sometimes that plays itself out in Australian circumstances. I think we're probably agreed that we don't need humans there as a permanent presence as yet. How developed is that conversation at the moment?
Hardly at all.
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S., the National Space Act of 2015 basically said it was weasel language that gave enough clarity to investors in companies like DSI and Planetary Resources, but it also said this has to happen